She was born into silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of expectation, soft, heavy, suffocating. In a house where prayers hung in the air thicker than dust, where sins had shapes and shame had a schedule, she learned early that being a girl was a condition that required atonement. They called her beautiful, and she hated it, because in their eyes beauty was a warning, a spark too close to dry straw, a danger to herself, to others, to God. So she began to erase herself, slowly, carefully, like someone scraping paint off a holy icon, not out of vanity, out of fear. She learned to hide her body in wool and shadow. She learned to lower her voice, her gaze, her appetite, especially her appetite. Her name was Catherine, Catherine of Siena. And from the moment she understood that food fed not only the body, but the will, she decided to starve the world out of her. She said she was promised to Christ, not metaphorically, literally. She wore his ring, invisible to others, but as real to her as bone. She refused marriage, refused comfort, refused the soft pleasures of linen sheets and fresh fruit and wine. She believed the body was a battlefield, and every hunger was a temptation, and so she went to war with herself. At first they thought it was piety, then they called it madness. But she knew what they didn't, that in a world where women had no sword, denial was resistance. The less she took, the less they could take from her. She stopped eating meat, then bread, then almost anything at all. Her body withered, her voice grew louder. She saw visions of Christ, of demons, of bleeding roses and open wounds and cities on fire. Her fasting was not just physical. It was symbolic, political, even mystical. She wrote letters to popes, to kings, to generals, telling them to repent, to return, to listen. And they did, because behind her skeletal frame was a fire they didn't understand. She walked into plague-ridden homes when no one else would. She held the hands of the dying. She kissed the sores of lepers, not because she didn't fear death, but because she had already made peace with it. To Catherine, death was not the enemy. The enemy was distraction, the noise of the world, the comfort of food, the allure of beauty. She wanted to be pure, not clean, untouchable. But what no one dared to say, what her hagiographers couldn't admit, was that beneath the sanctity there was pain, real, raw, aching pain. She felt hunger like a flame under the skin. She felt isolation like a knife beneath the ribs. Her ecstasies were edged with agony. Her devotion often came with vomiting, collapse, fever, and yet she refused to relent. Some called it divine, others a sickness. But maybe it was both, because what Catherine did was not natural. It was not sustainable. It was not sane. But it was honest. An honest reaction to a world that taught her purity was the highest form of love, and that love must be earned through suffering. And so she suffered, publicly, unapologetically, and the church, as it so often does, watched her die and called it holiness. She did not want to be touched, not by hands, not by glances, not even by thoughts. The body to her was not a temple, it was a trap. Flesh was weakness, desire was betrayal, every curve of her form was a test she had not asked to take, and so Catherine wrapped herself in denial like armor. It was not modesty, it was war. They had tried to tame her early, to dress her in silk, to betroth her to men with land and plans, but she refused. Not gently, not shyly. She fought with silence, with hunger strikes, with the kind of resistance that doesn't scream, but endures. When she was 13, she cut off her hair, bound her chest, scratched her cheeks to make herself less beautiful. She didn't want to tempt. She wanted to disappear. But Catherine never disappeared. She grew louder by shrinking. Her parents, overwhelmed and confused, eventually surrendered. She was allowed to live as she wished, cloistered not in a convent, but within the walls of her family's home, a cell within a house, a soul within a cage of ribs. There she fasted, prayed, bled herself in penance. There she began to speak to God, or perhaps to something that sounded like him. Her visions became the center of her existence. She spoke of marrying Christ, of being chosen. She said he placed a ring upon her finger, not of gold, but of his own foreskin, torn from his body and wrapped around hers. Most dismissed it as metaphor, but to her it was literal, sacred, flesh bound to flesh, purity not as a virginity, but as devotion so absolute it transcended comprehension. And people began to listen, because Catherine did not speak like a woman. She spoke like flame. When she entered a room, it changed temperature. Her voice had the rhythm of thunder and the softness of ash. She was impossible to ignore. The church had seen women like her before, mystics, visionaries, mad women, and usually it waited for them to collapse. But Catherine did not collapse. She climbed, and what she climbed into was dangerous. She began writing letters, hundreds of them, letters to popes, to cardinals, to kings, and not as a subject, but as an equal. She told the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, to leave Avignon and return to Rome. She told him to be a man, to stop cowering behind French politics, and he listened, not immediately, but eventually, because Catherine's power was not in logic, it was in conviction. She didn't argue, she declared. She walked into war-torn cities and commanded peace. She spoke to plague doctors and criminals and priests, and they listened, not because she was eloquent, but because she believed. Her words burned not because they were clever, but because they came from a place no one else could access, the place beyond comfort. She had no armor. She had no army. She had only suffering. And somehow that was enough. But here's the truth. History forgets to tell. Suffering is contagious. Her fasts inspired other women. Her wounds became models. Girls began to copy her. Not just in piety, but in pain. Refusing food, refusing help, refusing joy. They saw in her story a blueprint, not for holiness, but for annihilation. And the Church, ever eager to canonize female silence, called it divine. They never questioned why Catherine's sainthood required her to become smaller than herself. Because what Catherine was doing, whether she knew it or not, was making herself acceptable, not to God, but to the world around her. By the end of her life, her body had become a sermon. Every bone, every blister, every skipped meal was a line of theology written in flesh. Her blood became her scripture. She traveled barefoot across Italy, through disease, through heat, through war, preaching not with eloquence, but with absence. People bowed to her not because of what she was, but because of what she had given up. And that's the tragedy. That Catherine, who could have lived a life of rebellion, of intellect, of creativity, chose instead a path paved entirely with loss. Not because she lacked power, but because she thought the only way to use it was to destroy herself. Her body, once a battlefield, had become a relic in slow decay. Her bones ached constantly. She vomited nearly everything. Her skin was paper. She could barely stand. But still she smiled. Still she served. Still she refused. Even water toward the end. Even sleep. And those around her, priests, friars, devotees, watched and called it holy. But it wasn't holiness. It was despair dressed as discipline. It was trauma mistaken for transcendence. It was the kind of sainthood that asked women to die in order to be remembered. And Catherine, she obeyed, not for applause, not for martyrdom, but because she had been taught that pain meant purity, and she wanted to be pure so badly. She stopped wanting to live. By the time she turned 20, her body was more shadow than skin. The bones of her back pressed like thorns against the linen she refused to change. Her breath was shallow, her voice almost a whisper, and still she spoke with the certainty of someone who thought she was already halfway out of this world. In a way, she was. Catherine moved not like a person, but like an apparition, an idea that had torn itself from a body too small to contain it. She walked through death and called it devotion. The Black Death had turned cities into cemeteries. In Siena, the bells didn't stop ringing. The dead weren't buried so much as stacked. Priests fled. Nobles locked their gates. But Catherine, the girl who had once been hidden in her father's house, wandered into the center of it all. She touched the wounds others couldn't bear to look at. She cleaned bodies covered in sores, held hands already blue with infection, not to be seen, not to be thanked, but because she believed it was what Christ would do. But what she never said out loud, what she may never have admitted even to herself, was that she also did it because she didn't fear dying. She feared not dying well enough. Her faith was not the bright joy of heaven. It was the furnace of purification. And in that fire, everything soft had to be burned away. She wrote that the soul should hate its own body, that it must mortify the flesh. She believed pleasure, even comfort, was a kind of treason. And so she refused not only food but medicine. She refused sleep, laughed when told to rest. In one letter, she said she felt pain so intense she thought her bones were breaking one by one, and still she offered it as a gift to God. There are stories, not myths but accounts from those who knew her, of Catherine begging priests not to let her eat, pleading for the Eucharist to be her only nourishment, not bread, not soup, only the body of Christ, and even that barely swallowed. They say she would chew herbs until she vomited, that she drank only bitter water, that when her confessor ordered her to eat out of obedience, she cried with guilt for hours afterward, because to eat was to indulge. To indulge was to fail, and failure to her meant damnation. She was not insane. She was not delusional. She was devoted, and that is the tragedy. Because Catherine lived in a time when a woman's holiness could only be measured in absence. Absence of appetite, absence of anger, absence of ambition. The holier she became, the less of her was left. She was revered precisely because she was disappearing. The church didn't stop her. It couldn't. She was too useful. A living example of obedience, piety, sacrifice. She was proof that the soul could dominate the body, that God's love could transform a woman into a statue of the light. But Catherine was not light. She was burning, and the people closest to her knew it. Her mother wept in silence. Her sisters watched her vanish day by day from the bed they once shared. Her confessor Raymond wrote of her glory, and then confessed his own fear, his helplessness watching her fall into herself. Even the Pope, when she came to him in Rome, was struck, not by her beauty, by her absence. She was skin pulled tight over a vision. Her voice still thundered in the throne room, her letters still cut through marble, but her body was a warning. And still, she was sent to solve the problems of the men. She mediated civil wars, convinced rulers to return to the church, stood in the presence of emperors with her fingers wrapped around a cross and her stomach hollow as a drum. They say she glowed, but perhaps it was simply the way pain makes the eyes shine. Her last year was agony. She collapsed constantly, could not stand, could not hold a quill. Her mouth bled, her stomach rejected even water, and yet she begged for more pain, more suffering, because she believed it would make her worthy. In her final days she had visions of hell, of the world's sins, of herself covered in wounds she had never received, begging God for one more chance to bleed for him. Those who tended to her said her hands clutched at the air as if reaching for a cross only she could see. She died on the floor of a convent, not in bed, not in peace, on the stone, at 24, with nothing left to give, because she had already given everything. And still, we call it sainthood. We canonize her bones. We build statues. We quote her letters as if they are hymns. But we forget what she actually did. She starved herself to death in front of the church, and the church called it holy. And maybe that's the most painful miracle of all. When they laid her down, the women around her said she looked like a sculpture, silent and pale, limbs folded in unnatural stillness. Not because death had surprised her, but because she had rehearsed it, over and over for years. She'd practiced the art of vanishing so perfectly that by the time her final breath left her lungs, there was almost nothing left to carry away. Catherine of Siena didn't die suddenly. She disappeared gradually, in body and flesh and blood and breath, until only the idea of her remained, and the idea was unstoppable. But what happens when the body you once carried is no longer yours, even in death? They took her bones, not all of them, just enough to make her sacred in multiple places. Her skull's in one city, her finger in another. The rest, maybe, still sleeps in the grave beneath the church. But that's the thing about saints. The church breaks them even after burial, spreading them across the land like relics, as if presents can be manufactured through fragmentation. Catherine had given them her hunger, her agony, her obedience. In return, they made her holy in pieces. She would have accepted it, maybe even wanted it, because Catherine didn't believe her body belonged to her. Not then. Not ever. From the moment she began her fasts, her scourges, her nightly prayers scraped raw by guilt, she had surrendered ownership of herself to someone else. God. The church. The vision she had of Christ holding her hand, calling her his bride, his mirror, his vessel. But perhaps the most tragic thing is this. Catherine believed that in dying for purity, she was living fully. In her letters, she doesn't write like a victim. She writes like someone aflame. She believed she was free, that by denying her flesh she was claiming her soul, that by silencing desire she was amplifying love. But whose definition of love was she working with? Whose script did she follow? What world had convinced her that her femininity was a curse to be outwitted, a temptation to be erased? She didn't invent this theology. She inherited it. Catherine was born into a church that feared the female body. That turned Eve into the origin of evil. That taught girls that every appetite was a serpent, every pleasure a betrayal. Her mother had 12 other children. Her father worked until his hands cracked. Their house was narrow, full, chaotic. And in the midst of that noise, Catherine chose silence, because silence, in her world, was the only kind of power a girl could wield without being punished. But what began as silence became severity. She wasn't allowed to preach, so she wrote. She wasn't allowed to lead, so she advised. She wasn't allowed to command, so she obeyed herself into extinction. That's the paradox. Catherine didn't seek authority, but she found it by refusing everything else. And the church, always looking for symbols to validate its hunger for sacrifice, elevated her as the highest example of female holiness, not because of what she achieved, but because of what she endured. And this is where the story darkens, because what Catherine endured became a model. For centuries, women looked to her example, and they tried to copy it, not just in faith, but in form. The fasting, the guilt, the belief that to be holy is to hurt, the belief that the body must be beaten, starved, shamed into submission. Catherine became the blueprint for anorectic sanctity. They called it holy anorexia, a condition seen again and again in female mystics, girls who refuse food, sleep, warmth, because they had been taught that love must cost blood, that heaven must be earned through silence and suffering. And the church didn't call it illness, it called it inspiration. But inspiration for what? Catherine died at 24. That's not sainthood, that's a warning. A warning about what happens when devotion becomes a disembodiment, when a soul is praised only after it's separated from flesh, when a woman's worth is measured not by what she gives, but by what she surrenders. And maybe the question isn't why Catherine died, it's why she had to. Because holiness in her time, and sometimes still in ours, was only ever granted to women once they were no longer a threat, once they were quiet, once they were broken, once they were gone. Catherine was brilliant, fierce, unrelenting, but that's not how she's remembered. She's remembered as obedient, as pious, as pure, as if purity was ever the same thing as peace. There are saints who walked with fire in their hands, martyrs who bled in arenas, soldiers who carried swords and banners, men who debated doctrine until their voices split the air. But Catherine's power was quiet. Her revolution left no battlefield, no cathedral stained with the aftermath of war. Her legacy was written in the emptiness she carried, of food, of rest, of desire, of compromise. She gave the world nothing and everything at once. And the world bowed to her not because of what she built, but because of what she refused to take. They called her a mystic, a prophetess, the voice of the Lord in the body of a girl. But even as they crowned her with these names, they misunderstood her, because Catherine didn't ask to be known. She didn't seek recognition. She sought erasure. She didn't just starve her body. She starved her ego, her will, her humanness. And that is the most devastating part. Because what Catherine longed for, sure, truly, was not just closeness to God. It was distance from herself. She saw her body as a betrayal, a site of temptation, a weight that kept her from the divine. And so she punished it. Not with hatred, but with devotion so intense it became indistinguishable from self-destruction. She believed holiness was a process of subtraction, that to become divine, one must first unbecome human. So she began to subtract. First food, then sleep, then comfort, then rest, then her own voice, except in the service of others, until even her breath became a kind of offering. She left her family behind, walked barefoot across Italy, collapsed in churches, preached without ever calling herself a preacher, fought political battles in the language of God. But beneath all of this, the letters, the miracles, the reverence, there was a girl unraveling herself like thread, piece by piece, and no one stopped her. Not the priests who praised her, not the men who admired her, not the church that sanctified her agony and called it discipline, because they didn't see a girl dying. They saw a symbol being perfected, and Catherine, she agreed. She had so fully internalized the idea that pain was the price of purity that she saw her suffering not as tragedy, but as transformation. She wanted to be consumed, to disappear into sainthood like smoke into the rafters of a burning chapel. Even her ecstasies, her visions, were full of blood. Christ wounded, Christ weeping, Christ kissing her with lips still wet from crucifixion. She spoke of spiritual marriage, but it was not gentle. It was a union forged in agony. Her God was not a comfort. He was a wound that never closed, and she didn't want him to, because in pain, Catherine felt closest to salvation, and the Church, ever hungry for stories that reinforced its theology of sacrifice, wrote her story accordingly, elevated her, carved her into marble, declared her a doctor of the Church, centuries after her bones had turned to dust. They told the world that she was a model for all women, a beacon of obedience, a vessel of chastity, a triumph of the soul over the flesh. But they left out the part where she begged to die, the part where she confessed her exhaustion, the part where her body convulsed in hunger, the part where she asked her confessor not for relief, but for permission to keep suffering. Because to rest, she believed, was to betray her purpose, and that's what the statues will never show. Not the sunken cheeks, not the fever dreams, not the rotting teeth from years without nourishment, not the loneliness of being called holy but never held. She was surrounded by people who loved her image, but who could not touch her reality, and she was so far beyond them, floating in her faith, dissolving in her discipline, that she became untouchable long before she became immortal. And in that distance, she was praised, because to the world, a woman is safest when she is not quite real. Catherine became safe because she was dying. She became sacred because she was silent. She became holy because she was absent. And this absence, this mythology of disappearance, still echoes in how we talk about purity today, in how we treat girls who are quiet as good, how we praise restraint, how we romanticize sacrifice, especially from women, how we tell stories of saints who waste away and call it divine. But what if Catherine had lived? What if she had stopped fasting? What if she had said no, not to men, not to the world, but to God? What if she had claimed her body as her own? We don't know, because she never got the chance. She died before her 25th birthday, starved, exhausted, exalted, and still, centuries later, we celebrate that story as victory. Maybe it was. Maybe she found the transcendence she craved. Maybe her soul burned so brightly it had to break its body open to escape. Or maybe, just maybe, she was a girl who loved God so much. She never learned how to love herself. They say sainthood is a gift, that the holy are chosen, that their suffering means something, that it draws down grace, heals nations, breaks open heaven, that Catherine's life was beautiful because it was painful, and that pain, offered freely, is the purest form of love. But behind every gift like this there is a silence too heavy to lift. Catherine of Siena was canonized not because she lived, but because she refused to eat, refused to rest, refused to soften, refused to bend. Her life was a posture of resistance, but not against tyranny or oppression or empire. It was resistance against herself, against her own humanity, against every hunger that made her mortal. And we honored her for that. We built her into a myth so clean it leaves no blood behind. But the truth is, she bled. Maybe not from wounds we could see, maybe not from swords or knives or crosses, but from within, quietly, relentlessly. She bled in the moments no one painted, in the hours when her stomach twisted itself into knots, when she lay in bed unable to stand, when her hands trembled with weakness, and still she wrote letters, still she prayed, still she whispered praises to a God who never told her she could stop. We don't build statues of those moments. We don't canonize collapse. We canonize the result. Because Catherine's death gives us something to point at, something to celebrate, something to call divine. But if you strip the gold from the mosaics, if you peel back the incense and hymns and hagiographies, what you find is a young woman dying from starvation, in plain sight, under the watch of priests and theologians who believed her suffering was sacred. We turned her agony into inspiration, and we still do. You can find her story echoed in eating disorder forums, quoted in recovery clinics, referenced by girls who look at her as proof that there is something holy in becoming small, not because they don't understand her, but because they do. Too well. They recognize in her the voice that whispers, You are only worthy when you are withering. And that's the legacy we've let grow in her shadow. Because Catherine never asked to be an icon of purity. She never stood before the world and said, "Follow me into death." She was chasing God with everything she had, and everything she didn't. She was burning herself into light, hoping to disappear into heaven, to leave behind a world that offered women no way to live without being devoured. The church offered her one path, virginity or invisibility. She chose both. And yet, even in her disintegration, Catherine was powerful. Her words shook cities. Her letters reached popes. Her prayers moved mountains. Her spirit, however broken, refused to be silenced. That, too, is part of the truth. She was not just a victim of theology. She wielded it, transformed it, stood in rooms where women were not supposed to stand and spoke like thunder through a throat of ash. She was the contradiction the church could never solve, and that's why they sealed her into sainthood. But the real miracle of Catherine's life isn't that she died pure. It's that she managed in all her pain to still speak, to still love, to still move the earth with words written by hands too weak to hold a spoon, to still comfort the dying while she herself was fading, to still write letters of hope while her bones begged her to stop. That is not sainthood. That is defiance. That is a soul too bright to burn out quietly. And we should remember her that way. Not as a girl who died beautifully, but as a girl who refused to disappear without being heard. Because in the end, Catherine of Siena left more than relics, more than doctrine, more than marble statues and feast days. She left a question. Not for popes, not for scholars, for us. What kind of world asks a girl to starve in order to be believed? And what would it mean to build a world where she wouldn't have to? Because the hunger she carried wasn't just for God. It was for freedom, for meaning, for a kind of love that didn't require her to disappear. And maybe, just maybe, the holiest thing we can do now is to stop telling her story as if it ended in triumph. It ended in loss. And it is our responsibility to listen, not to the saints we've painted, but to the ones we broke. She died at 24, still loved, still praised, still hollow. Not because she wasn't strong, but because we never gave her another way to be.